Everyone is getting seated. We have the honor of having one of our fine midshipmen who's going to introduce Admiral Stavridis. David Larkin is a member of the Ethics Bowl team here. That's how I met him, but he's also a company commander right now, and he said he's wrapping up his final semester here at the Academy, so there's light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm going to turn it over to David to introduce the Admiral.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We now have the pleasure of hearing from retired Admiral James Stavridis, class of 1976 graduate and former NATO Allied commander. Admiral Stavridis retired from the Navy after 37 years of service and is now Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. As a prolific writer and innovative thinker, Admiral Stavridis has inspired me and many others to read, think, and write. Admiral?
I'm going to walk around a little bit if I can. I'm not one to kind of hide behind the podium. What I'd like to do today, I'm going to show a couple of images. I see people already getting nervous. Oh boy, here comes that brutal military PowerPoint. I assure you these are very, very simple images. They're really just photographs. David, thanks for a great introduction. Art, thank you for asking me to come and do this. I always say people hear my biography, you know, Supreme Allied Commander and all that, and they tend to think two things when they actually see me in person. They say, boy, I thought you'd be taller. And the second thing is they say, well, you know, Stavridis, if you're really that cool, why were you not a naval aviator? You know, why were you only a surface line officer? You know, because I drove ships. And actually, I wanted to be a naval aviator, but I had a really traumatic experience when I was a young boy that made aviation impossible. What I'd like to do today in slow fashion, if I could, is just begin by kind of walking around the world with you and talking about some of these conflicts that are the subject of your conversation over 2 days as you wrestle with ethical challenges therein. And my thesis, and we can pick it apart in conversation, is that the antidote fundamentally to failures in ethics, which are frequent, the antidote is not a bunch of rules and regulations. And today, for example, and I do not mean this in a critical way, but the Navy published a change to Navy regs, a long, detailed set of changes outlawing the use of inappropriate visual imagery being posted online, which I agree with. But at the end of the day, the ethical failure that occurred in the Marines and the Navy and frankly all the services of posting intimate photographs inappropriately, we're not going to solve that with a bunch of regulations. We're going to solve that with leadership. So what I'd like to do today after we look at some of these conflicts is talk about leadership in 21st century leadership. But let's start with the world and some of the challenges. And I'm going to focus on the post-9/11 world. As some of you may know, by the way, the little red circle there was my office. So I had a chance to catch a glimpse of the airplane as it hit the Pentagon. And I kind of realized on that day that we were in a new era, not only tactically, not only operationally, not only strategically, but in the world of leadership. And that's what I'll try and communicate as we talk about the world. So 9/11 kind of puts Al-Qaeda on the radar, but I think more importantly, it sets in motion a chain of events that create this. The Islamic State, which I kind of think of, and I'm old enough to do this, as terrorism 3.0. If 1.0 was the 60s and the 70s and the Red Brigades and the battle mine in Afghan and sort of Eurocentric, politically oriented, the Symbionese Liberation Army, terrorism 1.0. 2.0 Hit the pen drop. 3.0 is here. What's different? Why 3.0? Two things in these images. Upper right, they are entrepreneurs, they're innovators, they are making money. And we're closing in on it, and we're starting to shut some of that down. But that entrepreneurial spirit is something new and dangerous in this particular vector. And what's the second thing in this photo? It's the branding, the advertising, and the marketing. 4 years ago, nobody in the country, nobody, including me, could have recognized that black flag. Maybe a few specialized intelligence. Today, it is the most downloaded image on the World Wide Web. This is a new form of challenge for us as leaders. And the ethical questions here are profoundly disturbing. The way in which this group uses visualization, demonstration of torture, rape, human slavery to try and create a caliphate. Now look at Spain. I don't think Spain is going to be called on the loose anytime soon. But when an organization is this creative, this entrepreneurial, has their own vision of what leadership means, can recruit, proselytize, and control operations around the world, we ought to be pretty concerned about it. So what other conflicts should we worry about? Much in the news lately about Iran, about the possibility of unwinding the agreement with Iran. I'm no fan of that agreement, but I think the time of debating whether it was a good deal or a bad deal is over. It's a done deal. The question is, what do we do now? And this mix of geopolitical pressure from the Shia-led elements in the Middle East against our Sunni allies has a completely different overlay than the previous challenge we talked about. What else should we worry about? The most dangerous nation in the world is not Iran. I think it's North Korea, perhaps in a more tactical sense. But why is North Korea more dangerous? Because leadership matters, and its leader is very aptly named. He's Kim Jong-un, and he's unpredictable. He's not irrational, but he is unpredictable. He's untested. He's untried. He's got a really bad haircut. And he's already got nuclear weapons, probably north of 15. And he has the potential, increasingly, over time, to deliver those at range. So another part of the basket of challenges we face there. What about Syria? Talk about an ethical meltdown. 500,000 people dead, chemical weapons, children tortured, barrel bombing, blocking humanitarian activity. This is, in this case, I'll say the president is exactly right to categorize him as a monster. How does he fit into our set of challenges and what he represents? And then there's Vladimir Putin, who is a challenge for the United States because of his own deeply ingrained views, not only about the United States and NATO, but about Russia and its role in the world. And that puts us, I think, on a collision course. Therefore, he will be part of the set of challenges we talk about. And a rising China. Now, I, for one, do not believe we will fall into the so-called Thucydides trap, in which a rising power almost inevitably confronts an established power. You're going to have the extreme pleasure of hearing from George Friedman a little later on, who I think can address the historical context in perhaps a more predictive way. My own belief is that with China, we probably have the tools, the diplomatic capability, the confluence of some interests to avoid a significant conflict with China. But it certainly has to be on the laydown of what our leaders grapple with, to include human rights challenges within this powerful and rising state. And it's a lack of a democracy. I'm going to close with two challenges that I hope you will talk about specifically in terms of ethics in conflict. One is this: in the world of cyber, we have not begun to really unpack the legitimacy of using cyber, for example, to take down the electric grid of a nation, which has partially happened here and there, most notably in Ukraine, with the Ukrainian flag up there. We've also seen somewhat lower level uses of cyber, both against civilians and military in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Georgia, small democratic Republican provinces. I think cyber is an area in which the conversation about ethics and conflict is particularly germane. I'll close on this kind of list of challenges by saying I think the greatest ethical challenges that we may face in this century, in a conflict, will be not nation on nation, not human on human. I think there'll be pandemics. Look at the history of what happens in pandemics. Or if you'd like to project into the future, read a book called World War Z, which is about a pandemic of zombies. The term concentration camp comes in part from concentrating the infected, psychologically infected, politically infected. If you really have to fight a pandemic, the choices, ethical choices you have to make about who is quarantined and healthy, as opposed to those who are concentrated and unhealthy, are big casinos. How many die so that how many more can live? Pandemics occur with some regularity. And what happened 100 years ago? Spanish influenza, the Spanish flu. 40% of the world's population infected, 20% mortality rate. Top is Ebola, bottom is Zika. Examples. I think we're going to contain those. A twist of DNA, and the opponent we fight will be a virus, and a pandemic virus, and we will face some significant ethical challenges in that conflict. So with that, I'll wrap up on the context by saying two other things worry me a great deal. One is Brexit and the centrifugal forces that are pulling at Europe today. We're going to know a lot more on Sunday when the French elections transpire. I think the German elections are going to be stable and relatively centrist. There's not a great deal of difference in outcome at a certain level. After that would come the Italian elections. Brexit's already happened. These centrifugal forces are deeply concerning. And allies matter. So we ought to add that to our list of concerns. And what's our problem here? It's gridlock. We have political parties that can't seem to work for rational compromise. We have branches of government in conflict and confusion. We've certainly seen this before in American history, but I think it is an increasing pattern in our democracy that worries me. And all of it leads to this, a kind of inchoate sense that the world is just too hard, and we ought to just somehow come home, come back to Fortress America, build a big wall down in the south, and use those gorgeous oceans to buffer us. My view is we tried this before. We tried it about 100 years ago. When we rejected the League of Nations, we enacted trade barriers, the Hawley Smooth tariffs. How'd that turn out? Well, we cracked the global economy. We had a Second World War. Fascism rose, led right into communism at the end of it. I'm simplifying a lot of history here. But the point is, this idea that somehow we're going to come home and be safe and be better, I don't think will work. That's why leadership matters so much in this era. So right about now, you ought to say, okay, Admiral, I agree with a lot of that. I'm worried. what can leadership do to help us in these scenarios and these settings? So if you'll permit me to stay on the historical piece for 1 second, I want to give you 3 models of history, 3 models of leadership from history. And I'm going to start in the 19th century. This is kind of a famous map. This is in pink. In pink, you see a lot of countries. You see a few countries in white. The countries in white were the ones that were not invaded and colonized at one time or another. The 19th century is an age of colonization. It gives birth to this neocolonialism. And what is the leadership model of the 19th century? I'd say it's this character. Anybody know him? Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. Famous for saying that the great issues of our time will not be decided by chattering parliaments, but by men of blood and iron. Hence his nickname, the Iron Chancellor. This is a leadership style that is brutally hierarchical, male-dominated, zero-sum game, and leads us almost inevitably eventually into the conflagration of the 20th century. Speaking of which, what happens in the 20th century? So figuratively, this is what happens. The world turns upside down. Colonization departs the field. Nations become free. We go from having 40 nations to having 160 nations. And leadership styles change in the 20th century. I give you Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a much more benign figure. Genial, caring, gives us the Great Deal, creates a better world, takes us out of the Great Depression. Arguably our greatest president, 4-term president. No one will ever do that again. But what was his style of leadership? So I'll illustrate it by giving you a parlor game, if you will, that Roosevelt would play when he'd have guests in the White House from time to time. He'd get out a map of the United States and he'd say, draw a line across the United States, anywhere you want, from San Diego to Bangor, Maine, from Portland, Oregon to Jacksonville, Florida, from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. Draw a line. So the guest would dutifully sketch a line on this map. Roosevelt would then walk down that line, and he would tell you, not the state and the governor, he'd tell you the county on that line, and who was the county commissioner, and who was the head of the Democratic Party in that county. There are 3,000 counties in the United States. His leadership style was a kinder, gentler sort of appearance, but underneath it, an awful lot of manipulation, the ability to know where the levers of power were located, and to use them ruthlessly when he felt he needed to. 20th century leadership. Which brings us to today. A lot is different. First of all, I'll give you 2 things that I think are screamingly obvious but matter. One is transparency, and the other is speed of communications, hence this graphic. Things are moving in real time across the planet constantly, and it's very, very hard to hide it. Which means, where do our leaders come from now? From this process? Somewhat, certainly. But I would argue there are more broader definitions of who brings leadership to the table today in the 21st century. It's not just elected officials, although you see a couple of them. It's people like Oprah Winfrey, who's never held office but has enormous influence, could probably, if not certainly, become a political actor. Bill Gates needs no introduction. He's moving events around the world. He's influencing many global leaders. Bottom right, who's that?
Jack Ma.
Bang, Jack Ma. China. Angela Merkel in the center bottom needs no introduction. I would argue the most principled leader on the world stage today. Who's that on the bottom left? Modi, Mr. Modi. 800 million people voted in the Indian election. He's the leader of India. And who's that at the top? Get out your playlist. Lady Gaga, come on, Bad Romance, Poker Face. She has 40 million followers on Twitter, folks. This is leadership of varying sorts in the 21st century. So all of that, if I can kind of boil it down, means that we ought to have maybe a different tool set than we saw in the 19th century or the 20th century, especially as we grapple with ethical issues. So what are those tools? I'd argue, top of my list, I don't say that because I'm here at one of the great educational institutions in this country. I would argue it's education. Education. And leadership requires education. And not just at military war colleges and military academies, but where are the leadership programs tied so closely to ethics in our entire educational system? This is the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where I'm lucky enough to be the dean today. We've instituted several courses, and our students come get a master's by taking 16 courses. They now have to take at least one that is a leadership course and one that is philosophy ethics based. We need to replicate that. Education is in many ways the top of my list. What else? What else is in the leader's toolkit? You don't have to go to a place to be educated. You can open a book. And I'm in a room full of lifelong leaders, and I know that. And I am preaching, I'll draw on my Greek heritage here. I'm not preaching to the choir, I'm preaching to the Greek chorus. I know you agree with me, but what are we doing to inculcate this idea of lifelong self-education as an enhancement for leadership, as a tool of leadership? And what are we recommending that people read? I always say my foundational read once a week is The Economist, because it's unbiased, it's clear, there are no bylines, the reporters' egos are not involved. It's a powerful read. And having read the President's Intelligence book for almost 7 years as a combatant commander, I can tell you if you read The Economist every week, page by page, you will overlay about 80 to 85% of what the President sees, which is a long way of saying in this era of fake news and apparent fact and alternate fact, true fact really matters. Find good sources. We should all be reading books. Go back and reread Dereliction of Duty if you haven't read that in a while. Like I think many, I pulled out my battered, signed, first edition, signed by Lieutenant Colonel H.R. McMaster, good friend. By the way, just a side note on this whole thing of ethics and leadership. Anybody know what Brigadier General H.R. McMaster did in Afghanistan? He was on my team as I commanded the ISAF forces there. Go ahead.
The corruption czar.
He was the corruption czar. We picked him because of this, because of his character. He understands the nexus of ethics and leadership very well. And in that sense, candidly, I'd say he's a stranger in a strange land at the moment. But I think in the end, H.R. McMaster will influence that group much more than they will influence him. And the reason is because of a lifetime of education and reading and scholarship alongside his magnificent military career. We should read books like Black Flags by a journalist about what created ISIS. And I'd be remiss in the Stockdale Center if I didn't say, go back and read In Love and War about balance, about philosophy, about family. Or read a few good novels. Fiction is underrated as a place to go and read and learn. I'm going to now shamelessly self-promote my new book, right in the center, The Leader's Bookship, published by the Naval Institute. I have Vice Admiral Pete Daly, the head of the Naval Institute here. I'll tell you how the Leaders Bookshop came about. When I finished writing the obligatory NATO memoir, which is called The Accidental Admiral, because it was such an accident that I ended up there, my publisher came and said, Stavridis, you got to write a leadership book, you know, about everything you think about leadership. And I said, nah, that's really not me. I'm not one to tell everybody how to be a leader. What I said instead was, I'll do a project where I give you 50 books that you can read that will make you a better leader. Most of which are novels, plays, poetry, a lot of biography, memoir, history. There's not a leadership book on the list. It's an interesting project, and I enjoyed doing it. And here are 4 of the books that came off of Gates of Fire, about battle, Killer Angels, about the difference in styles of leadership, Ender's Game, cyber warfare, Finding Dominion, and one of my very favorite books, Commander Yankee in King Arthur's Court. That's an extraordinary book. If you haven't read that since you were 14 years old, you may recall it's about a 19th century engineer and scientist who magically is transported 1,000 years in the past to King Arthur's time. What is he? By definition, he's the smartest person on earth, right? He knows technology, metallurgy, rotation of the constellations. He knows the earth is round, for God's sake. He's the smartest person on earth. What happens? He can't convince anybody. It's a book about innovation, about how hard it is when you have the right answer, and you know you have the right answer, to convince others to give up the oath. It's an extraordinary book. So find time to read not only those great nonfiction books, but to read novels as well. What else can we do? I think the greatest single tool for a leader, and this is certainly debatable and arguable, tool, we're going to get to Bedrock in a minute, but the greatest tool is this. It's innovation. Stephen Jobs, I think, correctly said that what separates leaders from followers is innovation. And innovation can be as small as a Post-it. It can be as huge as putting a man on the moon. It can be as crazy as putting airplanes on a ship. I mean, think about that for a minute. The leap of imagination. Innovation matters for leaders. And this is what we think of when we think of innovation, right? High tech, maybe unmanned vehicles, and high-speed cyber activity. Yeah, that matters. I'll give you a different example. When I was commander of Southern Command, I had a problem, which was that the nations of Latin America and the Caribbean do not like the U.S. military very much. Why is that? It's because we've invaded them repeatedly over the last 150 years. Sometimes I'll say to an audience, well, how many times do you think the United States has invaded a country in Latin America and the Caribbean in the last 150 years? And people say, well, you know, not that many, maybe 60. And other people, better informed, will say, oh, no, you know, quite a few, you know, like 25, 30 times. Correct answer, 77 times. Now, that's invasion defined as the imposition of armed troops on a sovereign state without the consent of that government for political or economic purpose. That can be as small as a company of Marines going into Nicaragua. Well, we tend to forget that in the United States, right? You know, how many times have we invaded? Well, there was the Mexican-American War, and we've invaded Mexico 9 times. We've invaded Nicaragua 4 times. We've invaded Dominican Republic. I lost count. I mean, I have a list of these from my time as U.S. Southern Command. So the DNA is not good for us down there, for the military. Hence my problem, because I wanted to do effective work with my military. So I tried an innovation, not my idea, one of my teams, a very good one. Baseball really works. In the Caribbean, Central America, Northern South America, they love baseball. What do we do? You see the men in this picture as opposed to the boys? The men and the girls. The men in this picture are O1s, O2s from varsity baseball teams. They are chief petty officers who are all-star center fielders. We scared them up from U.S. Southern Command, which is, is a small combatant command, 50,000 or so. You can find some pretty damn good baseball players, believe me. We went to Major League Baseball. We said, hey, we got this idea to do baseball plays. Great, we'll give you uniforms. We need more. We need bats, balls. Great. We have the logistic muscle. This is an innovation that puts a very different face on U.S. military activity. We tie this to health and fitness. And sure, we continue to do the traditional mill-to-mill. But this kind of innovation, I would argue, very different than what we think of as technical innovation. The young woman who came up with this idea was a big baseball fan, was a Latina herself, and created real effect. Innovation is also this, which is sort of in the middle. This is Afghanistan, where Afghan police, you see in this picture, are reading books. And you ought to say, well, that's right. I thought I read somewhere that Afghans in this demographic were largely illiterate. You would be correct. The Taliban withheld education from them. Okay, so why are they reading? This is literacy training. We are training hundreds of thousands of young Afghans to read at a basic level, but sufficient so they can use a flip phone, so they can use a cell phone, so they can use smartphones, which are increasingly part of the scene in Afghanistan. It's not 100% success, but it is a powerful example of innovation. And lastly, on innovation, I would say that we always think about the good innovations. We need to get better at thinking about the black swans of innovation, about that virus whose DNA is going to twist, and all of a sudden Ebola can be communicated across the area. We need to think about what happens when a refugee population is weaponized to a real political effect. We need to think about what happens with Kim Jong-un. These kind of black swans are actually so often black elephants. They're in the room. We ought to see them more than we do. Seeing them is part of innovation. Innovation can be very hit or miss. You've got to fail fast and move on. You have to work to put down the roots of innovation. And above all, you have to honor the innovators. All of those, I think, are tools that 21st century leaders have. So one other tool that is vital is communication. And a lot of times I'll say to an audience, well, what do you think of when you think of communication? And a lot of times, almost inevitably, I get what people think about a megaphone. Communication must be a megaphone, right? That's how you can communicate. No. Communication is a bridge. We tend to forget that, especially as leaders. We want to reach for that megaphone. And what we ought to be doing is walking across a bridge to another culture, another personality, another identity, another nation. We're not very good at that. And let me tell you 3 things that can make leaders better at doing it. And I'll draw here on the world of nature. Behold the jellyfish. Jellyfish is a very interesting physiognomy. It is composed almost entirely by neural cells. It's one big sensor. That's how it kind of knows where it is and can understand the sea in which it swims. Leaders who pick up the megaphone need to think more like, how can I sense the sea around me before you pick up the microphone, the megaphone. Leaders also need alignment, which means you need a strategic plan for putting your communication together. What level will do what? We've seen a huge failure of this over the last 72 hours with the movement, or not, of the carrier strike group to North Korea. Where was the alignment? Did not work. People were reaching for the megaphone before they figured out the alignment. You can read about all this. We don't have time to walk through these. I have a whole talk I do on how to strategically communicate. Only after you do all the things I just mentioned, understand the how, the techniques, get the alignment plan, understand the sea that you're really swimming in, then you're allowed to pick up the pen and open it. That's when you begin to craft the message. So often, we talk about that old saw of ready, fire, aim. So often in strategic communications, it's ready, write, publish. I should say ready, publish, write. We get it wrong. We have to wait till we know what we're doing before we do the publishing. And lastly, on communications, I'll say you got to be in this world. And you're looking at that thinking, okay, retired admiral, these are sea lanes of communication, or ICAO routes, or fiber optic cables. Nah. This is the world according to Facebook. Almost 1.7 billion people are on Facebook. It's the biggest bridge ever built. It's the biggest megaphone ever constructed. Before we launch in this world, we have to do all the other things I've talked about as 21st century leaders. So last tool. I would say it's collaboration. And I picked that word carefully. And I'd invite you to kind of close your eyes and think about what's the first image you think when you think of collaboration or teamwork. And what often pops out is 8 guys rowing together, right? That's real teamwork. But really think about that for a minute. It's 8 guys doing the exact same thing over and over again. Now granted, you know, there's a coxswain, they speed up and they slow down and everything else, but this is the image I like for collaboration. Why? Because what these young ladies are doing is riding the peloton. And this is what real life is like. Real life is not that rowing show. Real life is messy. You're competing at times. You're drafting on others. You're collaborating together. You're messy. People fall down all the time. It's the image we ought to have as leaders when we think about the 21st century. Because we're never going to get that rowing boat together in the 21st century. We're going to deal with this, and we ought to rejoice in the diversity of this that gives us an advantage. Sometimes it'll be real formal, like the NATO alliance. You know, I'm going to tell you, NATO's a good thing. I believe in it. But more often it'll be this. It'll be coalitions. This is the coalition against the Islamic State. And sometimes it'll be this. This is a hospital ship. It's crewed by the U.S. Navy. But once you get below that level, a hospital ship is a huge collaboration. It's non-governmental organizations, Doctors Without Borders, Operation Smile, Project Hope, countless NGOs. It's allies who come in and participate in it. It is military doctors and nurses, but also civilian doctors and nurses, and it's interagency cooperation. It's an enormous, messy, inefficient, but ultimately powerful collaboration. And it's a good 21st century example. So those are kind of the tools. And I'm going to wrap up by talking about the bedrock, because tools are tools. There's something you put on a wrench to turn, there's something you shine a light on to illuminate, but what really matters are your values. So I'll close with this. First of all, I mentioned Angela Merkel. You can walk back up the plumb line from her to our founding fathers. Who's that on the right? Anybody recognize that young old people? That's Voltaire. There's someone over here. That's the young Voltaire, probably the best portrait ever painted of him. That's Cicero at the top, Socrates on the left. And there are Eastern versions of this, from the Buddha to many others. Holding those values, democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, charity, humility, kindness, those values matter, even in the world that we experience today with monsters lurking, like Bashar al-Assad. What else? We should remember as leaders, in terms of our values, that the world is transparent. Who is this? Jennifer Lawrence, Academy Award-winning actress, 24 years old. She takes some intimate photographs of herself. She intends them for a significant other, 2 consenting adults, no big deal. Unfortunately, she posts the photographs in an account in the cloud. They're hacked, and they're incredibly widely distributed. This is a crime. The perpetrator is caught, convicted, incarcerated. But I put her here to remind us as leaders that everything we do is transparent. Everything we do is in the public space. And it's personal. Think about what you're carrying around in that supercomputer in your pocket right now. So values matter. You can't write a regulation that will stop this. But you can strive to create a culture that will. This photograph looks terrific, right? This looks like a really wonderful U.S. Navy ship, 1949. I would invite those of you, particularly the military officers in the room and senior enlisted, what's wrong with this picture? There are 3 people missing in this picture. Colonel, if you were putting a formation together, would you have a gap right here? 1, 2, 3. Missing chief petty officers. You got a row of officers, and behind them you got a row of chiefs, but 3 of them are like left behind. They're just gone, departed. What happened? I don't know, but I spent a long time looking at this picture, and I did find the 3 chief petty officers. They are the 3 African American chiefs. One's right there, one's right there, and one's right there. And if you look at this with a microscope, you'll see they're chiefs because they're wearing service dress blues, not their hats. So you can pick them out from the enlisted sailors. Now, I don't know what happened when this photograph was taken in 1949, but I'll give you a guess. The XO, right there, probably put the crew in formation, because that's what XOs do. And then the XO told the captain, "Sir, come on down, it's time for the photograph." And the captain, this grumpy-looking man here with the scrambled eggs, and he does have a very annoyed look on his face. I would guess he comes down from his ship, he walks up to the front, he surveils the work of the XO, and he says, "You 3, get to the back of the formation." 1949. I don't know that's what happens, but pretty good guess. So why do I show this to you as leaders? For 2 reasons. One is, when you see something that looks just terrific, it makes your heart stir, which it did for me the first time I saw this. A friend of mine brought this to my office when I was the exec to the Secretary of the Navy, Richard Danzig. And a friend brought it in and said, "Look what my uncle had. Jim, isn't this beautiful?" I looked at it and I thought, that is beautiful. Gosh, what a great looking ship, great crew. And then I started looking at it closely. That's something leaders need to do. And the second thing is, you should ask yourselves, what am I doing right now in 2017 that's going to look really bad 50 years from now? That's a pretty good question for leaders to ask themselves in terms of their ethics and their values. Good book about it, David Brooks, Road to Character. Not a leadership book, a book of stories that helped me think through a lot of this. Closing notes. I think fitness matters. I think being in shape matters. It makes you sharper. It creates, I think it's part of what a leader needs to do, both for him or herself and as an example. And lastly, I'll give you a homework assignment if you want one. You don't have to do it. Go home tonight and on a piece of paper, write down who are 6 people that are your heroes. Who do you really admire? You ever done that? We all sort of have episodic thoughts like, yeah, I think Admiral Stockdale's really great, or I think Condi Rice is pretty sharp. But really consciously write down 5 or 6 names. And they can be people like these, You know Admiral Stockdale. That's the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, who I admire for what he's done at great political risk, delivering, I think, a solution. Condi Rice, I think, needs no introduction. To this crowd, George Martin needs no introduction. Bottom right, Michelle Kwan, Olympic medal-winning, outstanding athlete. Bottom center, that's my dad. Proud colonel of Marines. He's on there not because he was a brilliant military officer. He was a good, solid colonel of Marines. He fought in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, well decorated, commanded battalion level. He's on there because he was a great father. And that's what I'd like you to do tonight. Write down those people and then say, why do I admire them? And then this is the hard part. Write down, how am I doing? Do I have the political courage of someone like Juan Manuel Santos? Do I have the stoicism of Admiral Stockdale to overcome unbelievable adversity? Am I as good a father as my dad was? That's a tough thing to do, at least it is for me. I'd say pretty good exercise. All this is hard. Leadership is really hard. But in the end, it's what solves the ethical problems we've talked about. One more picture from nature. This is the cheetah. It's the fastest thing on Earth. It can go from 0 to 60 in just over 2.5 seconds. And it's optimized for speed, right? It's got a narrow head to cut through the air. It's got big, powerful shoulders, huge lungs to process all that oxygen, massive back legs to drive it. Whoops, wait a minute. What's at the tail end of that thing? So if you're the Lord creating this, or you're an evolutionary process, you can take your choice. Why would a cheetah, which is built for speed, have a tail that's like almost as big as its arms? Well, think about it. Because if you're going that fast and you want to turn, you better have something to counterbalance you. The cheetah's tail is what allows it to move at speed. So as leaders, I'll leave you with the thought that you have to move fast, but you have to be stable as you go. And finally, last image, and then we can talk about anything. I love this photo. I'm going to leave it up while we open it up for any comments or questions. This was taken 3.5 years ago. It's on a beach in Somalia. These are illegal migrants, and they're reaching up trying to get a cell signal with their flip phones. That's the reality of the picture. The symbology, the iconography of this photograph is pretty evident, right? It's reaching for hope. These are migrants trying to figure out the next step in their journey, trying to come to a better place, a better life. They're reaching literally and figuratively for the light. It's a picture about hope. So if you remember nothing else that we talked about today, I'll close with a quote from Napoleon, because short men have to stick together. Napoleon said that a leader is a dealer in hope. A leader is a dealer in hope. Whatever else you do, whether these tools resonate with you or these ideas resonate, as a leader, be a dealer in hope. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you. Can I open it up for comments and questions? Admiral Gaylor.
Admiral, great remarks. Thank you. Seems like there's a particular challenge today with another divide that it's been highlighted, especially in the last 18 months, is that there's a lot of people who don't think globally, don't think cooperatively. There's people who really don't relate at all and dislike people who attend Davos and go to Aspen, and people who go to Princeton and the like. So we've got this divide, and your tools, which are terrific about reading, education, communication, there's an entire group of people that feels like that's not them and it hasn't served them well. Could you talk about the challenge that presents?
I can. Let me do it in two ways quickly. One is strategically, and here, Pete, the tool I think we're not energizing sufficiently is the communication tool. In other words, in some ways, I would argue the globalist view is kind of like a Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court at the moment. You've gone back, you've got the data. You can show that 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty through this result. You can show the historical anti-solution of what happened when we walked away from globalization the last time. There are so many positive arguments, but we're not sufficiently capable of communicating those in a way that matters to those people. That's the strategic piece of this. And that's what my next book is going to be about, is what I'm calling not foreign policy or international diplomacy, it's domestic diplomacy. We need an embassy in Cleveland to explain to the Midwest why this works and why it matters. And I think there's a great case to be made. So that's the strategic answer. The tactical answer is globalization is creating winners and losers. The elites have motored too quickly, like that cheetah, moving too fast, and have not done the necessary to make whole those that have been left behind. And I think that gets into apprenticeship programs, education, some level of financial support, and creating a sense of opportunity in what is very clearly a psychologically devastated landscape in parts of this country. I don't think it's enormous or overriding, and I think we can make those people whole, most of them. And here I would say, look at Germany. Germany has created an extraordinary series of apprenticeship programs that train and move people without stigma into not going to college, but instead going into a wide variety of additional work jobs. This is a very long conversation. A terrific book that helped me understand the sensibility on the other side of this divide is Hillbilly Elegy, which is an absolutely terrific portrait of growing up in coal country. Others? Yes, sir. Good to see you.
Good morning, Admiral, and thank you
Sure.
for these great remarks. My name is George Lucas. I'm from the Naval War College,
Right.
Just down the street from you, as it were.
Indeed.
Uh,
By the way, I often, when I talk about education, my alternate photo that I show is a terrific shot of the Naval War College.
It's a beautiful campus.
Yeah.
My question's about Admiral Stockdale, whom you mentioned at several points. And of course, we're hosted by the Stockdale Center here. And his name comes up all the time in leadership and ethics. We remember him as a leader, not just because of what he experienced and how he led, but also because of how he wrote about it. He was, like you, a teacher and a scholar, and a writer, for which we're all grateful. But one of the things he wrote that I seldom see cited is his own conception of leadership itself, in which he taught that a leader must be a teacher, a steward, a moralist, a jurist, and a philosopher. I've heard a lot of leadership theories or concepts and formula. I've never heard that one before, and I've seldom heard people talk about it, even when they talk about Stockdale. Do you sense anything to be learned there from that rather unusual conception of leadership qualities?
First of all, they're the right series. Secondly, those are the ideas that I took out of In Love and War, which I think is his most approachable book in many ways. Thirdly, the book is a nice example of the way we find balance in our spouses and our families. So Sybil's voice is strong in that book. Fourthly, I'll conclude by saying, and I think you mentioned it, but I always think about the piece he wrote about what went through his head as he was parachuting into North Vietnam. And he,
The world of Epictetus.
exactly. He was thinking of the Greek philosophers, of the Stoics. And I think it's the perfect example of education as the bedrock piece, which, again, I hope I communicated. I think Admiral Stockdale continues to be not only an inspiration to those who know him, but I think underrated. And maybe that's a good project for the Stockdale Center or something I can participate in. But I take your point, and it's well stated and powerful. Thank you, George. Others? Yes, sir, back here.
Sir, we read a lot of futures, both fictional and nonfiction, and in all of them there was a lot of fiction of weaponization of space. You know, lethal or destructive force from, into, and within space. How should we think about this ethically? Are there strong ethical arguments against this? And are those likely to be successful?
I think there are not strong ethical arguments against it. To the degree that the oceans have been weaponized, that near airspace has been weaponized, I think it is simply an inevitable part of the human condition that space will be weaponized as well. So the question is not whether it will happen and can we construct an ethical or moral argument against it, but how can we at least mitigate and provide a code of conduct in what, in my view, will inevitably include weaponization. We've dealt with this as well, I think, slightly different way in the use of nuclear weapons, somewhat in the way of chemical weapons. In terms of the future piece of this, we're, again, very lucky to have George Friedman here, who I think can answer that piece of it and ask it better. Thank you. Someone over here. Yes, sir. Okay.
Sir, Chaplain Mallard. And to follow one of your first analogies, what would you anticipate is terrorism 4.0 and terrorism 5.0?
Yeah. I think 4.0 is already emerging, which is a global coalition, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda resurgent, Islamic State. This kind of global coalition we're starting to see come together in real ways. So I think that's probably the next step, probably 4.0. And 5.0, just to really scare you, is going to be when the tools, like biotools, like the ability to manipulate those viruses, come into the hands in a serious way. That's 5.0. And that, these are kind of two streams that are moving along. One is terrorism becoming more sophisticated, more global, more capable, more creative. And the other is technologies that are dumbing down to the point that they can put their hands on. We worry so much about nuclear. In the end, it's going to be bio. And here's a word to learn if you don't know what it is. Look up CRISPR, CRISPR on Wikipedia. That's 5.0. Yes, my introducer.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. And thank you for that very concise introduction. I tend to kind of run along at times.
Sir, the Brigade of Midshipmen is required to read Gates of Fire
I'm
before the end of the semester. And I'm a company commander, and it's my responsibility to make sure my whole company reads the book. And I'm trying to figure out how to get them to read it because they should and not because they have to. And as leaders, we want to not just be reading ourselves, but inspiring others to read. So how do we inspire others around us to read?
Sure. Well, I think Vice Admiral Daly will agree with me from our misspent youth in the surface Navy that one of the best things you can do as a captain of a ship, if you want your wardroom to read, is go up on the bridge, sit in your chair, and read a book. In other words, personal example. And not just sit there reading the book, ignoring everybody, but when you take a break and you put the book down, turn to your watch and say, I'm just reading Master and Commander. And there's this great scene in there. And just unpackage it a little. When you go down to the wardroom that night, say, hey, has anybody read Master and Commander? I just finished it, here it is. Put the book out there. The first and best principle of leadership, we all know this, right, is example. So I put that kind of at the top. Second, try and connect it with other media that might be interesting. Have you thought about having them, the wardroom, get together and watch the 300, the movie? That's based on the graphic novel, which I think in some ways it's better than Stephen Pressfield. Don't anybody tell Stephen Pressfield. So tie it to other media, particularly perhaps more, if you will, approachable media. And that's can be done with all these books. Killer Angels, not a great movie, but a reasonable visual treat. Thirdly, hook it to other books that might be of interest. And with Gates of Fire, you can look at trying to connect them with and it's a bit of a stretch, but you can connect them with a book like Killer Angels and make the comparative things. Hey, you know, Gates of Fire, 2,500 years ago. Killer Angels, 150 years ago. Similarities, differences. So find other points of comparison. And fourth, finally, find ways to connect it with life in the yard, in your case, but, you know, kind of real life. What's happening in the world today that resonates from Gates of Fire? I'll give you a clue. The Iranians used to be called Persians. What does that tell us about today's world and today's headlines? What can we learn about the Persian character and the Persian self-view as an imperial power that's almost ripped from the headlines today? I think we got time for one more.
One more, sir, that'd be great.
Sir, right here.
Yeah, this is kind of a complicated, maybe offensive question. But one of the things that I have been surprised with that was good about our current president, actually there are two aspects of this, of our current president's evolving military posture, is he was radically against announcing in advance what you're doing in constraints on weaponry. The other thing is he was against actual military orders coming from the White House. And if the recent press is true, the mother of all bombs stuff, that was actually delegated to the use of that was delegated to the combatant commander.
Sure.
Now what I see in Trump, if you look really hard and have a very good will, is a wily Nixonian approach. And I suspect McMaster's the brains and Trump is the unpredictable part. But in cyber warfare, which I do, in the tail end of the Obama administration, there has been this clamor for a clear strategy. When exactly would we reply to an attack and how? And I considered that the announcement of such a policy, the public development of it, a horrible thing. Although that had been the direction of much of military policy in the last 2 or 3 decades.
Yeah, I think that it varies depending on the level of what you're talking about. So I think at the very highest level, I do believe in red lines. I do believe that it ought to be a red line for a nation to invade the United States. I believe it ought to be a red line for a nation to detonate a nuclear weapon against another state. I think there are things that are so egregious, so high level. I put chemical weapons on that, used against anybody, but certainly against civilians. That is a red line. We ought to talk about what our responses are because I think it does have a deterrent effect. I think the next level down, I think it gets more questionable. I think that there are times when unpredictability can have an effect on an opponent's mind that can help your situation. And that is, I think, what is being attempted with Kim Jong-un at the moment to make him uncertain. And we can have a debate about whether that's pitched at the right place or whether it would make more sense to have crisp clarity. I think when you get a level below that, kind of, if you will, at the low operational, tactical level, it never makes sense to really transmit your punch. And that's what I think Trump is talking about. I don't think he differentiates in his own mind those different levels, and I think that's something H.R. McMaster can help him with. But I think your analysis, generally speaking, is on point.
Maybe a few.
Okay, and I think we're done, folks.
There's no point to that.
Thank you, Admiral, for coming all the way down from Boston for this. In our particularly muddied world, with all the challenges, the ethical challenge that we face, it's important to find the right way to go. So we have here for you today a Stockdale Center compass.
Oh, thank you.
So you can find a moral compass in the challenges. So thank you for helping us unpack some of those today, sir.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.